Chapter 9, Parts. July 9th, 2:22 a.m., aboard the Mach 337 Bobcat. With about 20 minutes remaining before they reached the next target location in Nomis, Jacob double-checked the nav controls, then turned in his seat to face Jonas. Jonas saw this and did a quick scan across his console to make sure there were no warnings of flags present, then turned his seat to face Jacob. It was time to settle on some sort of plan. Jacob spoke first. "Mr. Black, what have you got?" Jonas gave his reply in a calm and methodical way. "Seems like we either send one person to each location, making extraction more difficult, or we take extra risk with the option to send 3 to one location. Option 1, we get close enough to all 3 locations to scan them all at once, and the one who gets an affirmative scan goes in. Option 2, we set up scanning equipment at all 3 locations but return here, and we all go to the appropriate location once we find Emily. Option 3, the least good option, break into each one at a time." Jacob nodded. Yes. Trouble is, we want as little attention as possible, and if we set off alarms before getting to Emily, we'll have lost our likely only shot at this. Also, we cannot use the transporter without setting off alarms, thanks to our mole in the unit, who disclosed the waveform patterns to some of our enemies. Stanley had been sitting in a seat near operations, dozing off now and then, as he had been up for 2 days straight. Between nods, Stanley overheard the conversation, attempted to shake off the drowsiness, stood, and made his way over to Jacob and Jonas. Stanley stood between the two, some distance back, drawing their attention by his presence. Stanley spoke. "What if there was a 4th way?" Jacob replied. "I'm all ears if you have a better idea." Stanley continued. "I think there may be a way to get into all 3 at once, without getting any unwanted attention." Stanley reached over behind himself and grabbed a pad he had been using to pore over some various data. Pulling up a screen, he highlighted an area on the map. The location was just to the south of the Red Union in eastern Hindi. Stanley pointed to the location, saying, When Emily was taken from Alaska, War would have sent her to this train station in stasis. From there, train cars are sent to all 3 harvesting locations." Jacob kept eye contact a bit, then stared at the map with the highlighted train routes and processing centers. He nodded, affirming what was being said as he continued to listen. Stanley continued. 1 person per harvesting center. Once at the location, they can run a scan, find Emily, then contact us. Rolf interjected. "Just one problem with that. These centers are heavily fortified, and 1 person would have almost no chance at escaping, especially with a body in tow." Stanley argued back, saying, "We can use the transporter beam." Jonas added to the conversation. "There's a couple of problems with that idea, too. For 1, our transport signals are detectable now, and for 2, we can only use a single beam once every 10 minutes. Limitation of the technology." Rolf added, "Yeah, by the time we get one out, the others will be alerted, and I wouldn't want to try to survive for 20 minutes in a heavily fortified military structure going into lockdown." Stanley set the pad down, nearly ran over to the operations panel, and pulled up the transporter system schematics. Stanley pointed to some portion of the schematic, saying, "I know a way to turn the beam into 3, each with differentiated coordinates. The transporter's already fold space. We just need to put a couple creases in the fold so that it goes in 3 directions." Jacob was taking in the information as the other men hashed out the ideas. Rolf interjected again. "Even if we did find a way to split a beam into 3, our power systems can barely run 1. You're talking about using 3 times as much power as the primary generator can provide." Stanley spoke even more assuredly. "The engines operate on their own power source. When it comes to engine power, the power systems only regulate the engine power. They don't provide it. We can use the engine's power cells to generate the power by routing it through the drive system, then amplifying the power through the engine circuitry, while letting the transporter system draw the energy directly." Jonas shook his head a bit. "I don't know. It could work out, but if there's a surge or a short, that could blow out every system, turning the ship into a giant carbotanium paperweight. And if we blew a system mid-transport, super messy." Stanley spoke a bit lower, but with even more conviction. I know the risks are high, but I think it's the plan most likely to work if it goes right. Rolf chuckled. Sure, because things always go right around here. Everyone was silent for several moments until Jacob spoke. Well, they had better go right this time, because it's the plan we're using. Make it happen. Stanley tried to contain his exuberance, but some of it came through in the form of a clenched fist and a light celebratory stomp of one foot. Jacob gave his official order. Once we stopped at the Weiser's place to get the DNA, be ready to get to work modifying the systems. We only got one shot at this, yeah? Jonas sounded off a yes, sir, while Stanley nodded, wearing a face tense with resolve. Rolf silently nodded. Each went to their individual stations as the Mark 337 closed in on the Weiser family's home in Nomis. They would arrive at Nomis in just a few minutes. Once they arrived, they could travel under the ice to a location of the Weiser's home entrance, just a few hundred feet from the shack. Jonas, looking over the map, had an epiphany. Rolf, I'm sorry to ask, but is this the location I think it is? Rolf turned his head slowly to face Jonas with an angry-looking stare. Jonas nodded. Sorry I asked. Rolf slowly turned his head back to the system he was monitoring, still scowling, then engaged the controls somewhat roughly. Jonas blinked a couple of times with his mouth open partly, letting out a slow exhale, then allowed his gaze to fall down to the control panel. There was nothing for Jonas to do at the moment, so he awkwardly pressed some buttons in order to look occupied. The tense moment was broken by a low, trilling alarm coming from the console, indicating that they were close to their next destination. Jacob slowed the Mach 337 down to a crawl as they got closer to shore, where they would break a hole in the ice to surface just long enough for egress. The vessel dipped down at first, going deeper under the water. Then its nose was reoriented upward as speed increased. The surface got closer and closer until the vessel's semi-metallic nose pierced the ice, causing the insides of the two convex wings to impact with the underside of the ice. As the vessel started to slip backward after impact, a pair of mechanical arms came from panels on either side. Each made contact with the ice, both jabbing 5 articulating spikes in the ice protraction. After the vessel gained stability, the windshield recessed up into a slot meant for it, turning the front window into a hatchway. All that could be seen were flakes of snow and ice, flung at blurrying speeds by whipping winds. The Mach 337's metallic floor was now ramped at an angle, but poles and floor divots were there to provide traction and gripping points in case of such a situation. Before climbing out, the crew would don their cold weather gear. Stanley still had his own gear, but the crew would use that provided by the organization. There was little difference, save that the Matic gear was white to better blend into snowy backgrounds, while Stanley's gear was a light gray. Jacob made sure the ship was secure on both ends, then spoke. Okay, Jonas, I want you to go with Mr. Weiser. Help him to get whatever we need. Mr. Luga, get your long rifle and cover them as they go. I will use Mr. Weiser's notes to get started on connecting the transporter to the engines. Each of the crew members gave an acknowledgement and got straight away to performing their required tasks. Rolf kept watch as Jonas and Stanley climbed out onto the ice and snow. Going into the snow, Jonas and Stanley quickly disappeared from natural view. Rolf had already swapped the scope of his rifle from his biological eye to his mechanical one, which could display visuals to the brain in many spectrums and had the ability to calculate ballistics while aiming with any synchronized device, enhancing Rolf's accuracy to 10 times that of an ordinary expert shooter, even in normally blinding conditions. Jonas and Stanley kept in touch through earpieces and tiny collar-mounted microphones, as small pips on a dress uniform. Rolf noticed a form off in the distance and spoke through the headset. You two might want to hang to the right a little bit. Looks like a mama bear of the 12-foot variety at your 11 o'clock, so you might want to avoid that. Stanley and Jonas adjusted their path accordingly, leaving more room between themselves and a giant carnivorous bear. They both wore goggles and kept their gaze low. Otherwise, snow accumulated on the goggles so fast one could not possibly maintain vision through them otherwise. Their steps through the deep snow were deliberate and calculated. The small shack housing the entrance to the compound could not be seen from even a dozen feet away, as the storm was vicious and relentless. The Matic goggles ensured that they could see through even such nasty whipping winds and chaos. After a couple minutes navigating around the path of a polar bear and fighting the elements, Jonas and Stanley were at the entrance to the Weiser family home. Jonas puzzled at seeing no latch or knob anywhere on the door. Seeing this, Stanley put up a hand to signal Jonas to move aside. Jonas took a step back, allowing Stanley to approach the door, which was situated toward the right side of the front of the structure. Stanley put a gloved hand flat against both ends of the top of the door, then gave both corners a gentle shove inward. A mechanism clicked. The door recessed about an inch, then slid toward the left in a mechanical groove. Once the door moved to the side, the interior of the entrance was revealed. On the outside, it looked to be little more than a wooden 10-by-10 shed. The one window on the back wall was frosted and gave no hints as to the contents of the interior. The rear left of the interior revealed a metal cage, a series of buttons, and an elevator shaft. Once inside, Stanley slid the outside door closed again. Stanley gestured Jonas towards the cage, leading him in, then stepped into the cage himself. With the press of a button, the outside door slid closed again. Stanley then slid the cage door shut, then pressed the lower of the two red buttons. An electric motor below engaged the chain drive, lowering the elevator gently down through the shaft. After descending about 30 feet, the elevator came to a halt against the sensors of the metallic floor of the basement. The two men stepped out of the elevator into an octagon-shaped chamber with 7 other doors, each of which was labeled with only a number, ranging from 1 to 8. The south faced the elevator shaft, while the north faced the number 4. Rooms 1 through 3 were on the left from the southern perspective of the elevator shaft, while 5 through 7 were on the right. With the elevator fully descended, a mechanism on the ground covered the elevator shaft with a false floor, making the shaft appear as an ordinary storage cage. The two stepped out into the dark octagon for the lights to come on from above, flickering at first, then humming like a power transformer. The octagon-shaped chamber was about 10 feet in any direction. To the right of each door was a keypad for entering a security code. Stepping into the chamber, Stanley spoke. "It's a 7-digit code, the same for each door." Jonas looked about curiously. 7 digits, huh? Stanley nodded affirmingly. 8675309. Jonas burst out into laughter. I never pegged you for a rock guy. Stanley responded, "Nah, I prefer classical. The wife, though, pure metalhead. Well, Emily, too, for that matter. Her room is number 7. My lab is number 4. Jonas paused and thought for a moment, then spoke. "I don't want to intrude upon your home, so how should we proceed?" Stanley stopped for a moment, then answered, "Go into my lab, find the cold storage unit, and remove vial number 682. That container holds the DNA we need to find Emily. While you do that, there are a few personal items I need to go through." Jonas nodded affirmingly, turned to the door to the lab, input the code, and went inside. Within a moment of going inside, Jonas found himself struck by the sheer plenitude of books, notes, equipments, and experiments. He searched the room looking for the cold storage unit, only to discover piles and piles of notes, schematics, and logs, all written on bits of notebook paper and in paper journals. Passing through what seemed to be an entire lifetime of study, Jonas found the door to cold storage. Opening the door to the large metallic freezer, Jonas found the samples to be in perfect numerical order, with gaps between some of the numbers but none out of place. With little effort, Jonas found the appropriately numbered container and carefully removed the small metallic vial from the storage unit. Meanwhile, Stanley was stepping into Emily's room. He flashed a tiny smile upon seeing Emily's paintings still hanging on easels. Most of the paintings focused on either scenes in nature or spiritual subject matter. In one corner of the room was a 100-armed man with a dummy for practicing holds on the floor. Posters of metal music bands like Metallic Crunch and Iconia were hung above the bed. As Stanley's eyes scanned across the room, they fell onto a little white teddy bear with a pink bow tie and a pink vest on the end of Emily's vanity dresser. Mrs. Fluffles was Emily's early childhood best buddy. Emily had owned that bear since Stanley won it at a carnival and gifted it to her when she was but 4 years old. Upon seeing the little toy bear, a floodgate of emotions opened up inside. Stanley leaned forward and picked up the little bear with both hands, as though it were itself a small child. As Stanley held it out in front of him, tears started to stream down his face. He pulled the bear inward, clutching it to himself, then started to sob bitterly and uncontrollably. He took a step back, leaning his back against the far wall. He slid down to the floor, his back against the wall, holding on to the bear, saying Emily's name to himself softly over and over. In the outside chamber, Jonas was exiting the lab. He stopped short, overhearing Stanley in Emily's bedroom. He walked quietly to the threshold of the door and stopped, keeping his back to the door. In a gentle tone, Jonas spoke. "Mr. Weiser, I have what we need. A scan-verified stem cells. Let me know when you're ready." With that said, Jonas left the hall for the elevator and took it up to the ground level inside the shack, stepped outside, and pressed the down button to send the elevator back down. He would wait upstairs until Stanley had done what he needed to do, as a father and as a husband, and mourning over a dead wife and missing child. Thinking about that, Jonas decided to stay out of the way and wait. For a moment, Stanley lost himself in his grief. Suddenly, his facial expression changed from sadness to rage. His eyes were already swollen from despair, fatigue, and the recent crying, but now his face was red with wrath. He stood up, gently putting the little bear into a jacket pocket, stifling back some tears and wiping his face with a snowy sleeve. He stepped up onto the bed, standing at the head of it. He gently took down the magnets, collected the posters, and rolled them up. Going over the opposite wall, he grabbed Emily's middle school martial arts awards. He held those items under one arm and left the room. Still wearing an expression of bottled, focused fury, Stanley went into he and his wife's bedroom. He took the wedding picture from the end table next to the bed. On the left side wall was a locked glass cabinet with an old bottle of Canadian whiskey inside. A brass plaque read, "Open in case of tragedy." Stanley bashed the glass door with the back of his hand, breaking the glass. He removed the bottle of whiskey, tearing up his glove on the jagged glass. He put the whiskey bottle into a deep pocket in his inner jacket. Standing over the end table where the picture had been, Stanley took off his left glove and removed his wedding ring. With a trembling hand, he wiggled the ring off of his finger and left it on the end table. He then stormed out of the bedroom in a furious huff. Stanley went briefly into the lab. He pulled a canvas bag down off the wall and started to shove many papers inside, especially those from the side of the room dedicated to genetics research, as well as several medical papers. Wrapping one of the bag's straps around his shoulder, he stormed out of the room and back into the octagon-shaped hall. Finally, he opened the door to room 6, the workshop. Stanley went past several wood and metal projects in various stages of completion. From a display of many ancient weapons at the rear of the room, Stanley pulled down a katana sword in a scabbard. Pulling it out of the scabbard, one could see Japanese symbols etched into the side of the blade. In Japanese, the letters read, being roughly translated, "If you are thinking of revenge, then use this on yourself, for you are already dead." Stanley secured the bear, the posters, the awards, the whiskey, the sword, and all the papers, and went into the kitchen behind door 5. He turned on the gas to a burner, but didn't light it. Leaving the room, he took a small metal trash can with him. Setting it down, he took out some matches and ignited the materials in the can, dropping the rest of the burning matches into it. He then swiftly moved to the elevator, dropped the trash can in the hallway, and pressed the up button with a violent shove. The elevator went up, and the hatch opened. Jonas greeted him, saying, "Are you—" Stanley answered the unfinished question, saying, "Let's get the fuck out of here." With that, Jonas gave a nod, and the two men left the shack entrance to the underground home. The two got no more than a few dozen feet away before the ground shook, followed by a loud crash, then flames shooting out of the roof of the little wooden shack. Jonas was startled by some of it, but Stanley just plowed forward, undaunted by the fiery explosion behind him. Immediately afterward, Jacob could be heard on the headset. "Whoa, boys!" That just might attract some attention. You better get back here real quick like. Jonas and Stanley double-timed it back to the Mach 337. Jonas and Rolf extended hands to assist the two in getting back into the vessel through the front window. Once Jonas and Stanley were on board and had something to hold on to, Jacob engaged the front window mechanism to reclose it, and then the mechanical arm controls to release the vessel from the top of the ice. At the touch of a few dash surfaces, the vessel receded back into the hole, into the ice, and resubmerged. Jacob first made sure all the seals were secure, then went to the navigation screen. Once there, he set a course for a location just south of the Red Union, on the border between the Red Union and Hindi. At this harbor location would also be a train that regularly sends shipments into Red Union territory. After years of disuse, followed by an explosion, the Red Union had refurbished the train station for their own use. Although in Hindi territory, the station was run by Red Union soldiers and scientists. This would be their way in, if only they can get the team members onto the train without incident. Stanley took this time to find a storage locker and put away the items retrieved from his family home. With the vessel now on course for the next destination, still traveling underwater, Jacob turned his seat and addressed the crew. In Hindi, security is tight, but we're not on their shit list. Still remains to be seen, though. We might have to be sneaking into the station itself, which is run by the Red Union, unless someone has a better idea. Jonas remained standing, holding on to a support pole. Just get us near the building. I know a way to get us directly inside. We'll need to don some dive gear, but we'll not have to expose the ship. Rolf stood, walked over to Jacob and Jonas and spoke. We'll have to sneak the packages into the distribution room, which means that Stanley will have to come along to do the packing, then go back to the ship. Stanley objected. You want me to stay behind during my own daughter's rescue mission? Jonas answered. I know it's not right, and under other circumstances we would have Mr. Greenleaf or some other officer to oversee the mission, but that's not possible. What we need is for someone to operate the transporter and to make sure nothing happens to Mr. Greenleaf. Rolf added, We're trusting you to make sure things are coordinated correctly. We're the soldier boys, so that means we do the fighting. You're the smarty pants, so you do the thinking and directing. Stanley nodded. Then do exactly as I say, or I'm leaving you here. Rolf chuckled at Stanley's sharp comment. Ha! You got it. Jonas stepped away, saying, I better get the dive gear ready. While Jonas prepped the diving gear, Jacob navigated the Mark 337 to a location just 100 feet or so off the eastern coast of Hindi. Once the vessel came to a position and halted, the crew slipped into the diving gear and readied the acetylene cutting torches, making sure each functioned before being attached to the utility belt. Stanley assisted Jonas in making the final modifications to the engine and power systems so that all would be ready to go when the time came. Stanley turned and gave a thumbs up to the rest of the crew as the modifications were completed. Before leaving, Stanley quickly checked in on Connor, who still lay in a bunk, comatose, hooked up to a blood IV. Once everyone's gear was checked and ready to go, Jacob went to the rear of the vessel and activated a mechanism inside of a small metallic cage about the size of two hands. A section of the floor started to recede, revealing a second hatch a few feet underneath. Soon after, the second hatch opened, revealing dark ocean water. One at a time, each secured and checked their mask and oxygen and jumped down the narrow hatch into the water. Each wore a head-mounted lamp and a diving mask with a HUD on the inside, showing depth, direction, coordinates, local pressure, and an estimated remaining time of usable oxygen left. Each tank contained enough oxygen mix for up to 4 hours, far more than the necessary 20 minutes or so needed to make the trip in both directions. Jacob, Jonas, Rolf, and Stanley swam in close formation, with Jacob in the lead. With the press of a wrist-mounted mechanism, Jacob received a visual on his HUD provided by an attached sonar scanner. The four swam at a depth of about 60 feet toward a metallic underwater tube that used to feed cool water to a turbine. Now it was in disuse, and a gate had been installed to obstruct access. A 6-minute swim got the four to the gate. Each readied their individual cutting torch and began cutting the bars away in a separate corner of the gate. Within a few minutes, the last bar was cut. Jacob grabbed the gate on two sides, and with a brisk tug, freed the gate from its resting place. Jacob let it go, and it fell several feet to the ocean floor below, kicking up a bit of dirty water. With the gate removed, Jonas swam into the 5x5 tunnel first, followed by Jacob, Rolf, and then Stanley. The pipe was horizontal at first, then started to slope upward to an eventual 60-degree angle. Before arriving at the surface of the water in the tube, they would discover U-shaped bars that acted as an eternal ladder, meant for maintenance crews. Once above the level of the ocean, they would climb. As each climbed above the water, the HUD replaced depth with altitude. According to the schematics, at an altitude of 22 feet above seawater, they could cut a segment of the pipe to create a portal by which to egress into a large storeroom. They swam, they climbed, and at 22 feet up, Jacob retrieved his torch and started to cut an elliptical hole. Coming right up behind, Jonas also took his torch in hand and started to cut from the other side, also starting from below. Within just a few minutes, a hole just big enough to squeeze through had been cut into the side of the piping. Once the hole was cut, the material started to fall inward, prompting Jacob and Jonas to push back against the plate of the material so that it didn't drop down the pipe, potentially blocking it, and so that it didn't go crashing down to the concrete floor, making unwanted noise. Jacob and Jonas both handled an end, setting the cut portion of metal gently onto the concrete with minimal noise. With the newly made hatch set onto the floor, each slipped candidly into the mostly dark room between two rows of wooden crates. Moving swiftly and quietly as possible, they took off the dive gear and put it into their duffel bags with their other equipment. Next, the crew would have to find 3 stasis units and get them scheduled to arrive at 3 separate stations. Once all 3 had arrived, they would be cleared to act. Jonas held up a scanning device and checked the screen. According to the given schematic, the processing center was just outside the storage room door and to the left. This late at night, there would be minimal staff, if any at all, in the building, but there would be security. The 4 snuck very quietly across the room towards the door. Jacob made a hiss sound to alert the others and whispered, "Psst! Laundry!" Jonas popped his head up to take a quick look around, further assuring that no one else was in the room. Keeping his head low, he quietly made his way over to the container. Jonas reached into his boot and produced his combat knife. Cutting the strap sealing the lid of the container allowed the lid to be removed. Jonas reached into the container, pulling out several one-piece uniforms and complementary jackets. The uniforms, red with a gold stripe, bared the insignia of Red Union employees, a fist between a sickle and hammer. Jonas eyed the size of each uniform and tried to match each one to a member of the team. As Jonas handed out the uniforms, it became clear that each was soiled in such a way as to indicate that the wearers had most likely died inside the uniforms. Everyone got into the cleanest uniform possible, but each had some stain of blood or some other thing on it. With the new uniforms donned, they made their way quietly out of the storage room into the adjoining hallway. No sooner than the 4 had stepped out into the hall, a Red Union officer came around the corner, seeing them immediately, having not even showed up on any of their scanners. The officer spoke in a distorted voice. "What are you doing near storage?" Recognizing that this was a Necrosidious and thinking quickly, Jonas spoke carefully, being careful to get his accent correct, as the language of the Red Union was a blending of Russian and Chinese. "Sir, we have a huge mess to clean up, and there are no EV suits in there." The officer grunted under its breath, then responded, "Ugh. Gear for hazard protocol is located in the north wing. Do you even read the bulletins?" Rolf spoke up, being careful to curate his words, as a Necrosidious can sense any human lie instantly. "Sir, we just arrived here. We want to clean up the mess and get out before sunup." The Necrosidious officer barked out, "Get on with it, then, and take better care of your uniforms. You look like you died in them." With that exchange, the Necrosidious officer resumed walking south down the hallway. Once the officer was out of the area, Jacob let out a slow sigh of relief. Finding no other persons on the scanner, Jonas put it back away, having already memorized the layout of the building. Jonas used a finger to point north, to which Jacob nodded in the affirmative. Jonas spoke once he felt it was safe. "This is disturbing. Our scanners are ineffective past 10 yards. Must be some kind of interference." Acknowledging that, Jacob led the way, taking the crew north through the hall, then took a left into a room, the door of which was marked with Junction 1. Once inside the junction room, one could go in one of 4 directions. The north door was marked Hazard Protocol. The crew went through the north door into a hallway that had been partially rebuilt after an explosion. Jonas got goosebumps as he passed through the hall, which had in the past suffered an explosion as a result of choices he had made. What remained of the concrete was still black from the fiery explosion that had occurred. Portions of the concrete wall that had been destroyed had been filled in with shoddy constructs of wood timbers and plasterboard. The hall opened into a room that one might recognize as having been the loading area for passenger trains about 8 years ago. Knowing the history of the location, Rolf stopped in his tracks as Jonas made his way cautiously forward, wearing a grim expression. There was a heaviness in the air, and a smell as though something had been burned there. The halogen lights above flickered, lending an even more ominous sense of foreboding to the room. Rolf stood staring at the spot thought to have been the epicenter of death for the explosion. Jonas, knowing the significance of the room, spoke softly. "We best be moving, yeah?" The suggestion was met with silent nods and slowly shuffling footsteps. As the other 3 slowly started to move on, something caught Jonas's attention from the corner of his right eye. Letting the others move off some, Jonas stayed behind to investigate, responding to a strong gut feeling that there was something important here. A bit of shiny metal was sticking out of a pile of debris and junk left over from the explosion. Jonas carefully removed the item to find that it was the remains of a syringe. It could have easily been left behind by somebody partaking in a drug, or it could have been dropped from a bag of medical waste, but something was tugging at Jonas's senses, suggesting it was somehow significant. Jonas took out his scanner and gave the old needle a pass. His eyes opened wide upon seeing the result of the scan, but he said nothing. Looking about the room some more, Jonas also found the remains of a handheld video game, My Pretty Rainbow Pony. Jonas put the old beat-up, burned remains of the game into a pocket, as well as the needle, held onto the scanner, and jogged north to catch back up to the rest of the group. The other 3 looked behind it briefly as Jonas caught back up, but then went back to navigating forward. Being as discreet as possible, Jonas ran the scanner over Rolf from behind. Rolf turned around, but only to see Jonas scanning the floor. Jonas verified the scan results twice, then moved close to Stanley. Tapping Stanley on the shoulder, Jonas made the shh gesture with his right index finger in front of his mouth. Saying nothing, Jonas showed the scans to Stanley. Stanley quickly put the pieces together, but said nothing, looking just as shocked as Jonas. Jacob glanced backward to see how the party was doing, just in time to see Jonas and Stanley staring at a scanner, apparently in awe of some result. Jacob asked, "What's got you 2 looking so spooked?" Jonas and Stanley both answered, almost in unison, "Nothing." Jacob stared questioningly while Stanley and Jonas remained silent. Jacob's face became more stern. "Stay focused, will ya?" Jonas and Stanley simply nodded and mumbled, "Sir." Overhearing this, Rolf turned around. "What the fuck is going on here?" Stanley answered, "Now is not the time." Staring first at Stanley, Rolf then turned his gaze to Jonas and started to walk closer. Jacob lightly grabbed Rolf's shoulder to redirect him. Rolf angrily shook Jacob's hand off his shoulder with a recoiling shoulder action. Rolf stared at Jonas with furrowed eyebrows and lips, looking angry. "If you got something to say, now's the fucking time to say it, asshole." Jonas remained silent and let his gaze drift off to the side, avoiding eye contact. Stanley walked by Rolf, almost whispering, "Come on." Jacob spoke to Rolf more sternly, this time. "Not now!" Rolf resumed walking toward the destination at the end of the hall, brushing his shoulder against that of Jonas rather roughly as he passed, knocking Jonas a few inches to the side with his collision. Jonas shook it off with a headshake, then resumed his place in the formation, wearing an expression of relief as Rolf finally passed by and moved on. Once they reached the end of the hall, they encountered a door with a keypad requiring a code for entry. Seeing this, Jonas approached the keypad, then stopped in front of the door. Carefully extracting a flat object about twice the size of her credit card, but just as thin, from an inner shirt pocket, Jonas placed the object flat against the numbers on the keypad. Holding it flat against the numbers, he squeezed the top of the card, causing a beam of light to go down across the numbers. Removing the card, Jonas could see which numbers had been pressed, and looking at the angle of the prints, could make a reasonable guess as to which order they were pressed in. Getting a single number or a sequence wrong could possibly set off an alarm. Jonas carefully chose each number to press. Upon the fourth input, Jonas started to move a finger towards a number, then hesitated, instead pressing a different number, then pressed the next 3, entering in a total of 8 digits. Jonas held his breath as the keypad made a slight beep, after which the sliding door opened to the left. Jonas let out a sigh of relief with the rest of the crew as the door opened without incident. Once inside, the crew found a set of full hazard suits with hoods and face masks. These outfits would be able to conceal each member entirely. They put the dive gear into a bag and hid it behind a couple of barrels near where they had cut the hole in the pipe. Jonas closed the door behind as each member of the crew started to don the hazard gear. Each also grabbed a large bag labeled Hazard Cleanup. Jonas came inside, put on his gear with the others, then grabbed a hand truck and secured it to a 50-gallon drum with the same biohazard markings. With their disguise complete, they could now make their way to the processing center and refrigeration units. The crew then made their way through various corridors and rooms towards the processing center without running into any snags. Once just outside of the door to the processing center, Jonas repeated the same procedure as he used for the storage room door. Jonas waited in anticipation for the beep, only to be greeted by loud, whirring klaxons and flashing red lights. Everyone paused, slightly shocked, looking at each other, though no one could see through the hazard mask. Within seconds, a small, angry-looking young man in a red uniform came storming down the hallway. In the Red Union language, he muttered to himself, "Damn lazy maintenance crew." Having muttered that, he took out a walkie-talkie and shouted into it, "Turn off the damn alarm, and get someone to fix this damn broken door." The Red Union soldier removed a pistol from his holster, held it by the barrel, and smacked it into the keypad several times, causing sparks to fly and the lights under the numbers to go out. The officer then pulled off the faceplate and yanked at 2 wires underneath. Touching one of the wires to the metal door frame, the door slid open, allowing access to the processing center. The Red Union officer then sighed and spoke, "Sorry about that. As you were?" The crew just nodded at the officer, who then got a call on his phone and walked off to answer it. "Hello? What? I don't even own a car." Fucking warranty bullshit. With access to the processing room, the crew could seek out the means to stow away on 3 trains bound for organ processing centers. After a brief investigation, the crew found the processing room to be empty of personnel. Jacob gave orders in a low tone, almost a whisper. "Mr. Luga, get 3 of those stasis units ready, and help Mr. Weiser make the proper modifications. Jonas, go into the computer and prep the labels and such, so that these things are ready to go as soon as possible. I will keep watch." Jacob took up a position near the door and kept lookout for possible trouble. Rolf and Stanley got to modifying the stasis containers so they would appear to be functioning while sabotaged and not freeze the contents, namely them. Bodies sent to harvesting plants are transported in a frozen state to be thawed when organs are extracted and then refrozen. Proper sabotage of the transport stasis unit would ensure that the men did not freeze to death on the way. Once all 3 arrive, they are to receive a signal to start a synchronized search. Once the units had been modified, each man had to first remove their hazard suits and also their upper clothing, as specimens were normally shipped naked. The top of the casket-shaped stasis unit had an upper window for viewing the specimen inside. Jonas had a phial of fast-drying liquid with which to coat the inspection window so that the body inside would appear frozen through the colored filter. Finally, Jonas produced and applied the shipping labels. Jacob gave his last orders before departure. "Mr. Weiser, once we are in the boxes, you are to be sure we each get stacked in each of the 3 piles, so we end up with one man going to each of the different centers. When Mr. Weiser sends the signal, it's time to find Emily. Once you're ready for the extraction, give the signal, and the transporter will pick us up as soon as Mr. Weiser sends the beam. All right, then? Takes about 2 days to get there, so get comfy and make sure you pee before you go. Let's get this done." Stanley went about the business of sealing each man, Jacob, Jonas, and Rolf, into their individual stasis units. Using the hand truck, he put each man's container into a pile. Using the hand truck, he put each man's container into a pile of cargo bound by train for 3 different stations, 3 different organ harvesting centers. Once everything was set up and ready to go, Stanley had to find his way back out of the station into the submerged Mark 337. Stanley thought of going straight out the door, but heard some voices in the hallways. Not wanting to get caught, Stanley paused to think of a solution. Meanwhile, the voices got a little nearer. It seemed that somebody was stopping at each door to search the various rooms. Stanley got an idea. He went to the label-making machine and quickly crafted one slightly larger than the label on the nearby barrel. He produced a label that read, "Dry Storage 4, the storage room the crew had cut their way into. Stanley quickly but carefully covered up the original label with a newly made one. Once that was done, he moved the barrel closer to the door, climbed inside, then pulled the lid down and shut himself inside of it. No sooner than a few moments later, the door was forced open and a Red Union station worker entered the room. Seeing the barrel very inconveniently in the middle of the entrance, the worker went into a huff, grabbing the nearby hand truck. The middle-aged woman muttered to herself, "Stupid boys, always make mess, I always have to clean up after." Still mumbling and complaining to herself, she wheeled the barrel into the hallway and down the corridors to Dry Storage Room 4. Ranting on, the Red Union employee left the room, sealing the door behind her. Stanley stayed still and remained quiet to the best of his ability for several minutes. Once a few more moments had passed, and hearing nothing else, Stanley dared to open the lid to exit the barrel. Trying to lift a leg over the rim of the barrel, Stanley lost his balance, tipping the barrel over and falling with it. Grunting in slight discomfort, Stanley shimmied his way out of the barrel and got onto his knees. Standing up, Stanley turned around to see a tall young woman in a Red Union uniform. Startled and reacting as quickly as possible, Stanley reached for the pistol in a holster attached to his belt. Just as Stanley's hand got a grasp on the weapon and drew it out, the officer's hand grabbed the barrel from an angle, bending his fingers backwards around the gun, breaking a finger, allowing the attacher to snatch the gun from his grasp as Stanley yelled out in pain. As the officer attempted to turn the gun to aim at Stanley, he lashed out with his other fist, hitting the gun, knocking it out of her hand and across the room. Grabbing his own hand with a swift action, Stanley snapped the finger bone back into place with a stifled grunt, just in time to get tackled to the ground by the very aggressive young Red Union officer. As the officer maneuvered to get some hold on her target, Stanley's mind went back in time to remembering moves that Emily had ambitiously taught him after coming home from sessions with Jacob. He attempted to counter a move the officer made with something he had learned, only to get countered and bound up in another way. Working frantically, Stanley, still lying on the ground wrestling his target, managed to get one of her arms into a hold. Stanley blurted out, "Aha!" No sooner than he had celebrated, Stanley suffered a sudden and swift knee kick to the groin. Yelling out in a huff of frustration, Stanley rammed his forehead directly into the officer's nose. The impact made the lady figure wince, giving Stanley just enough time to get free of the hold and onto his own feet. Before the young lady could stand, Stanley rushed in with a swift kick to the face, causing her to roll over on the floor. Stanley came in to stomp on her face, to only find his boot intercepted by her hands, followed by a twisting force to be applied rather suddenly to his ankle. The officer then pushed upward even more violently, forcing Stanley to land on his backside. Stanley attempted to stand in a panic, only to find he could put no pressure on the dislocated ankle without seething pain. As Stanley hobbled on one foot, the officer, with her nose bleeding, threw a roundhouse kick and whacked Stanley in the right temple, disorienting him and sending him onto his knees as he twisted around and fell to the floor. The officer moved in to attack again, but even through blurred vision, Stanley could see a metallic pipe on a shelf next to him. He grabbed the foot-long piece of metal and kept it concealed as the officer approached. As she came close, she bent down to grab Stanley by the collar, but before she could do anything else, Stanley lashed out with the metal bar, whacking it across her left knee, causing her to fall to the floor with a scream of pain. Stanley went to swing the improvised weapon again, but the enemy soldier intercepted the blow, catching it in her hands. They both struggled for the pipe for several seconds when the officer managed to pry the pipe from Stanley's grasp. Nearly falling back as she gained hold of the pipe, the officer next found her face impacted by Stanley's other fist, sending her to the floor on her back. Stanley held onto the pipe, hobbling across the floor to where the officer had fallen. As she attempted to get to her feet, standing up with a loud yell, the officer rushed forward, using her shoulder to bash Stanley into some shelving behind him. As the officer rushed in to attack again, Stanley pulled at the shelving behind him, causing it to come down, raining down all sorts of metallic items in front of him, some of which hit his attacker. Brushing off the damage, she ran ahead again, stepping up onto the shelving to leap off of it. Eyeing a metallic hook on the end of a chain nearby, Stanley stayed put as his attacker charged. Once she leapt off the top of the overturned shelving, Stanley caught her in midair and redirected her trajectory. Getting hit in the face during the process, Stanley managed to redirect his attacker right onto the metallic hook suspended by a chain. The hook pierced the back of her ribcage and protruded slightly from the center of her chest. She gasped, choked, and gargled as blood came from her mouth and both of the wounds in her torso. Convulsing and choking, she died within seconds. Stepping and stumbling back, Stanley nursed his broken hand, just in time to get a glimpse of the butt of a rifle coming straight for his face. There was a sharp impact, a bright light, and a feeling of disorientation. Then everything went black.